certainly, no, I don't think that's the case at all. Thank you.
In a procedural vote, the House today agreed not to continue debate on the crime bill and sent the $33 billion measure back to committee. As it now reads, the crime bill provides money for new police officers and new prisons and would ban 19 types of so-called assault weapons. The bill would also fund crime prevention programs and impose life imprisonment for those convicted of 3 violent felonies. The crime bill will be among the topics tomorrow morning on our weekly Journalist Roundtable. The call-in segment will start at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 Pacific, and includes Susan Cornwell of Reuters, Rita Braver of CBS, and Elaine Povich of the Chicago Times. Next, a look at today's floor action in the House leading up to the dismissal of the crime bill. Members first took up the rule, which determines whether a bill will make it to a final debate and vote. This segment runs about an hour and 40 minutes.
Yes, sir. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 517 and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 517, resolved that upon the adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider the conference report to accompany the amendments of the House to the amendment of the Senate to the Bill H.R. 3355 to amend the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 to allow grants to increase police presence, to expand and improve cooperative efforts between law enforcement agencies and members of the community, to address crime and disorder problems, and otherwise to enhance public safety. All points of order against the conference report and against its consideration are waived. The conference report shall be considered as read.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Goss, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time is yielded for purposes of debate only, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, could we have order? This is probably one of the most important.
Chair will ask members who desire to converse to retire from the chamber. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 517 waives all points of order against the conference report on H.R. 3355, the Omnibus Crime Control Act, and against its consideration. The rule further provides that the conference report shall be considered as read. Mr. Speaker, this rule will allow the House to consider the conference report for H.R. 3355, the Omnibus Crime Control Act. Earlier this year, the President urged Congress to set aside partisan differences to pass a strong, smart, and tough crime bill. In response to this call, the House has before it today far-reaching legislation that does exactly that. The conference report establishes a violent crime reduction trust fund to assure that $30.2 billion be available over the next 6 years for anti-crime activities. Funding the trust fund will be made available through the elimination of 252,000 federal jobs. This conference report will help our nation to move toward a future free from crime and violence through a commitment of resources unprecedented in the history of our nation. The legislation authorizes $8.85 billion in grants to state and local governments to replace 100,000 new cops on the beat. What this represents is a 20% increase in the number of police officers nationwide. For South Carolina alone, this could mean 1,600 additional police officers on the street. Make no mistake, The legislation before us today is tough legislation aimed at taking back our streets from the criminals. The conference report provides $6.5 billion in grants to help states build new prisons for incarceration of violent repeat offenders. The legislation establishes the death penalty for over 60 federal crimes, including the murder of federal law enforcement officers, kidnapping, terrorism, drive-by shootings, and carjackings resulting in death. The conference report contains 3 strikes and you're out. Legislation which mandates life imprisonment for anyone convicted of a third violent felony. It also provides that juveniles 13 years or older could be tried as adults in federal court for crimes such as murder, assault, robbery, and rape, and includes the use of boot camps for youthful first-time offenders. Such boot camps can provide the discipline and training necessary to deter young people from embarking on a life of crime. The conference report makes sure that police are not outgunned by criminals and bans military assault weapons. Each year, the problem of gun violence gets only worse as more assault weapons find their ways into the hands of criminals. Mr. Speaker, could we have order, please?
A couple of days this week, but we haven't made a final decision. The gentleman's point of order is well taken. The House is not in order. Gentleman from South Carolina.
The conference report makes sure that police are not outgunned by criminals and bans military assault weapons. Every year, the problem of gun violence gets worse as more assault weapons find their way into the hands of criminals. These weapons are 18 times more likely than other guns to be cop killers and 16 times more likely to be traced to crime than other firearms. The conference report contains provisions to ban 19 listed weapons, copycats, and other clearly defined semi-automatic guns. The conference report also addresses the causes of crime. Focusing only on the symptoms of crime will never solve the problem. The underlying causes of crime have to be addressed as well. The conference report provides funding for community programs intended to prevent crime, such as summer school programs and after-school programs. The legislation authorizes $125 million for programs to give young people positive alternatives to gangs and provides $300 million to stimulate business and employment opportunities for low-income, unemployed, and underemployed individuals. The conference report also creates programs to reduce violence against women. The legislation increases federal resources available to combat sex and domestic violence through education programs, law enforcement training, and national domestic violence hotlines. The legislation also provides $4.5 billion in grants for shelters for battered women and their children. Mr. Speaker, every major law enforcement organization in the country supports passage of this conference report. Organizations such as the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, the International Brotherhood of Police Officers, the International Union of Police Associations, the National Association of Police Organizations, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Police Executive Research Forum, the National Troopers Coalition, and the Police Foundation. In addition to the 2 largest prosecutor associations, as well as groups representing cities, towns, and counties that are urging the Congress to approve this legislation, these groups include the National District Attorneys Association, the National Association of Attorneys General, the United States Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, the National Conference of Republican Mayors and Municipal Elected Officials, the National Conference of Republican Mayors and Municipal Elected Officials, the National Conference of Democratic Mayors, and the National Association of Counties. Mr. Speaker, far too many of us no longer feel safe in our own neighborhoods. Violent crime is on the rise across our nation, and the time has come to ensure all Americans the freedom to live and to work in safety. The conference report before us today is not a panacea, but it is an important step in turning around this country's crime problem. Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 517 is a fair rule that will allow this House to consider this wide-reaching conference report. I urge my colleagues to support the rule and the conference report, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina for yielding me, asking unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, yield myself such time as may consume, and at this time yield to the distinguished minority whip, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrich, 4 minutes.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 4 minutes. Without objection, so ordered.
You know, the country should ask itself, why has a vote on the rule become such a close vote? Why have the President, the Cabinet, virtually everybody available been calling everyone they can to find one more vote on the rule? But I think what people need to understand is that a vote on a rule is a vote on a procedure. And this has been, for this bill, a terrible procedure. Let me make very clear. For members of the Congress on the Republican side, this bill became available at 7 o'clock last night. Now, the conference ended on July the 28th, and on July the 29th, Lamar University issued a press release thanking Chairman Brooks for $10 million. So in the first 12 hours after the conference ended, a conference in which no Republican was involved, no Republican had access, no Republican was informed, within 12 hours, the staff found the first piece of pork, made sure their district issued a press release. But still nothing happened. And they didn't have the votes. Why? Because this is not just about one item. This is a bill that has $33 billion in spending. It has 20 new social programs. This is a bill which cuts the FBI. It cuts the Drug Enforcement Administration. I suggest to every member read the Buffalo newspaper, where the FBI director is quoted inappropriately, being honest, inappropriately saying the truth, which is that his agency, the FBI, gets cut, the DEA gets cut, that mayors and police chiefs are worried. Now, later in the day, the administration got him to send a letter up because otherwise he'd have had to resign. But in the newspaper, he told the truth. In a so-called crime bill, we're cutting the FBI. And yet, at the time he said it, no Republican member had seen the bill. It hadn't been available. Now, why wasn't it available? Well, this is what Chairman Brooks said. And every member ought to listen to this. And you ought to ask yourself, how are you going to go home with any sense of self-respect and vote yes on a rule for a conference report you haven't looked at? This is what he said in the Rules Committee. He was asked, what are you asking us to waive? When you vote for this rule, you're voting to waive points of order. And he was asked, what are you asking us to waive? And this is what he said, quote, if I had a list written, I wouldn't give it to anybody because they would use it against me. Go to the floor, say, here are the items that are under the scope. No, I don't do that. So the chairman of the committee, on behalf of a conference report which had never been filed, refused to tell the Rules Committee what we're going to vote yes on. So if you vote yes, and in the next week the news media finds the pork, they find how bills have been weakened, and you listen to Congressman Zimmer later and Congresswoman Dunn tell you how this bill in its current form weakens the part on sexual predators. Weakens it, doesn't strengthen it, takes care of the ACLU, and it protects sexual predators instead of protecting communities. Finally, at some point, Mr. Fazio, in the world of fantasies he's been in, having been alarmed about the Christian right, will warn you about the Republican National Committee and say, we're applying pressure. I'm entering in the record a letter from Chairman Haley Barbour. Republicans who want to can vote their conscience on this. All I'm asking him to do is say flatly, You haven't been consulted. You haven't been informed. You haven't seen the documents. It's weaker on crime. It's weaker on sexual predators. It cuts the FBI. It cuts the Drug Enforcement Administration. Vote no on the rule. Send it back to conference and insist that they write an honest bill out in the open where everybody can see it.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Schumer.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, we have heard more untruths in the last 4 minutes than we've heard in a long time on this floor.
Clerk will report the words.
Mr. Speaker, may I amend that to say factually inaccurate?
Without objection, the gentleman's words will be replaced with the words truly inaccurate.
Truly inaccurate. Thank you, Mr.
Is
Speaker.
that the gentleman's request?
That is fine.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, we have heard more factually inaccurate words in the last 4 minutes than we've heard in a long time. I submit for the record a statement from the FBI director supporting the bill put out on August 10th. I submit
Gentleman from New York.
You may laugh, but you know why you're laughing. And that is because every time this bill is improved, you find a new objection. Remember the Racial Justice Act? We heard from the other side, they want the bill except for the Racial Justice Act. The Racial Justice Act, in my opinion, regrettably, is not in the bill. They are still not for it. Then we heard from the other side they wanted $8 billion in funding for prisons. There is now $8.4 billion for funding in prisons. They are still not for it. They wanted truth in sentencing. They got truth in sentencing, and yet they still oppose this rule. They still come up with one excuse after another, to give the American people an up or down vote on the crime bill. So the time has come, my colleagues, for truth in voting. If you want to do what our constituents are pleading with us to do, which is make the streets safe, tough laws on punishment, smart laws on prevention, you will vote for this rule, because we cannot hide behind any procedural smokescreen. If you vote down this rule, there will be no crime bill, and the American people will suffer.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Solomon from New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for the time. And, Mr. Speaker, when this crime conference report was filed on this floor last night at 7 o'clock, I was assured that plenty of copies would be available to the Rules Committee in 2 or 3 minutes. In fact, only one copy of this 972-page bill for the conference report was delivered to the Rules Committee, and Republicans first got a copy of it 23 minutes before the scheduled start of the Rules Committee debate. Mr. Speaker, the Rules Committee then proceeded to report a rule waiving all points of order on this monstrosity. One of the rules waived was a requirement that members of this House have 3 days in which to learn about the report and what is in this report. There is not a member in this House that has any idea what's in there. Mr. Speaker, there clearly are a great many other rules of the House that are being violated in this rule. But when we asked the chairman of the Judiciary Committee for that list, we were told that even if he had that list, he would not give it to us because it might be used against him. Mr. Speaker, that just isn't right, and you all know it. With regard to the conference report itself, there are a few good provisions in it, but those good provisions have been so overloaded with social program giveaways and soft on crime provisions that the bad in this package far outweighs the good, and you know it if you take out the politics. The conference report eliminates mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug traffickers. We all needed that in that bill. This provision is retroactive and would result in 10,000 criminals being put back on the street. 10,000? Mr. Speaker, one of the best ways to judge a piece of legislation is to see who supports it and who is opposed to it. In this case, why are the liberals, who are always opposed to tough penalties for criminals like the death penalty, why are they for this? And why are conservatives like me, who always vote to crack down on criminals, why am I opposed to it? The answer, Mr. Speaker, is obvious. This is not a crime bill, as much as the liberals would want us to make us think so. This is a welfare bill with a few good things to put in there to cover it. For example, this bill creates 1,000 new social worker positions to run all the dance lessons programs, all the arts and crafts lessons, all of the midnight basketball programs, those old CETA failed programs from 10 years ago. There is funding in this bill sufficient to hire 2 new social workers for every new cop on the beat. That's what this bill is all about. This bill throws a huge amount of money around in a way that is not likely to have any great effect on crime, but the effect on the taxpayers may be very, very huge. $30 billion of the $33 billion in this package comes from the Violent Crime Reduction Trust Fund, which is supposed to come from savings achieved by laying off 250,000 federal employees. How many times are we going to use that money? This is the 5th time. Mr. Speaker, this bill lets criminals out of jail who have committed crimes with guns and takes the guns away from law-abiding citizens. That's wrong. This is a terrible bill. We can defeat this rule, and we can come back here with a real tough crime bill that we could all support, and we would be doing what's right for the American people. Please vote against the rule.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, for purposes of debate only, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richards.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is the vote of the year, all rhetoric aside. We either break gridlock or we cave in once again to special interests and partisanship. Health care, Haiti, the economy, this is the vote of the year. And what is the alternative? If this rule goes down, how many here actually think that we can come up with another crime bill? We have no way of ensuring that the good prevention measures that are here, that the good punishment measures that are here, and the 100,000 cops on the street will survive once again. The NRA and every group that did not get what they wanted in this bill will be back. If this rule goes down, there'll be no crime bill. And I can assure you that if we go home and look our constituents in the eye after town hall meeting and one-on-one and polls and the message being do something about crime and we don't, I think we're going to pay. And don't call some of these programs social welfare programs. These are programs aimed at the young men and women of our inner cities, men and women that have lost hope. These are prevention programs designed to help these young people cope with the future. Don't call them social programs. These are investments in the future. If we move again and kill this rule, there will be no crime bill. Or if there is, it'll be a lot worse than what we have here. Vote for the rule.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished member from Illinois, Mr. Hyde, who has spoken so well on so many of these relevant subjects doing with this bill.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to revise the Senate.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. Speaker and my colleagues, I want to make it quite clear that I still support the legislation concerning the assault weapons forbidding the future manufacture for 10 years and the future importation of assault weapons. I still believe in that and I still support it. But I can't vote for this bill. This is an awful way to legislate. There are 154 jobs programs now on the books costing $25 billion a year. Al Gore and his Commission to Reinvent Government talked about consolidating these overlapping, duplicative, redundant programs. Instead of consolidating, we're proliferating. We're throwing 30 new social programs at a cost of $8 billion. I did a little research, and I looked up the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, shades of Lyndon Johnson. You ought to read it. It is identical with what we're doing here. Has there been an improvement in street crime, in drugs, in drive-by shootings? We spent millions for the same thing. And our answer to the festering crime program is more of the same. There were no hearings. We didn't look at these programs and see which of them we're triple funding. Social workers will be competing with each other in a tug of war to get clients to attend their self-esteem, their craft, or their dancing classes. Meanwhile, the people are ducking from stray bullets. This is not a decent, responsible way to legislate. And then the coup de grace. $10 million for this university in Beaumont, Texas. God love the chairman. I wish I had half his skill in getting things for places in my district. And this was done not in the dead of night, probably about 4 in the afternoon, after the conference was through, after the books were closed, handshakes all around, press interviews, and then $10 million for someplace in Beaumont. That's what characterizes this whole legislation. It's a disgrace. So let's go back to the drawing boards. I don't mind social workers. I think they're great. They're underpaid. But let's look at programs that can work, that can accomplish something. Let's not just shovel with a trowel hard-earned tax dollars onto this program. We're not legislating responsibly. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of debate only, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman, Maryland's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman for yielding. In 1991, I stood where the Speaker stands now. It was early in the morning, as you recall, and we passed a crime bill. It was a tough crime bill. It had many of the provisions that are in this bill, and it went to the Senate. It had none of this social spending that you now talk about so concerns you. But in point of fact, notwithstanding that, the Republicans in the United States Senate filibustered the crime bill, and it did not pass, and they did not send it to the then Republican president of the United States. The fact of the matter is, I want to tell you, in my community and in yours, there are children being killed on the streets of America. People are concerned. They want us to act. They want us to act now, not later, not tomorrow, not after a filibuster, not after another election, not after Bill Kristol tells you, hey, it's all right. It's all right to vote for something now. Yes, the Democrats may claim credit. Yes, it may be good for America, but no, don't take Bill Kristol's advice. Send them home empty-handed, which is what Bill Kristol is telling all of you to do, because if you do, those parents on the streets of America, in the schools of America, in the communities of America, they will pay the price, not those of us who sit in this chamber. This is a tough crime bill. Its time is now. Let us vote for this rule. Democrats, let us come together. America sent us here to act. Let us act today.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Archer, for unanimous consent request.
Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule. The big print giveth, the small print taketh away. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to distinguished gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Member of the committee.
Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is not an issue of Republicans and Democrats. More accurately, it's not an issue of liberals versus conservatives. The issue on this rule is whether we will legislate responsibly, both procedurally and in substance. There is a group in town that is circulating petitions to all members of this body. pledging that they will not vote for any health care proposal that they haven't read. And that's a legitimate request when we're dealing with a seventh of the economy and something that affects all of us. But doesn't the same apply to this bill, which has $33 billion in spending, it changes criminal procedures, and which its sponsors claim will make the streets safer and lock criminals in jail? Doesn't the membership of this House have an opportunity to read this bill? Shouldn't the media and the American public be able to analyze the provisions of this bill? Those who vote in favor of this rule will say very clearly no, because this rule waives points of order. There is no point of order that will lie on the fact that if this bill is brought up, the 3-day layover rule will be waived. The conference finished its work on July 28th, and it wasn't until 7 o'clock last night that the conference report was filed, and the printed version of the report wasn't available until 10 this morning, less than 6 hours ago when the congressional records were distributed. There will also be no point of order on the conference exceeding its scope. We know that a point of order would lie if it weren't for waiving the points of order on the $10 million for Lamar University. Now, last night we took a great step forward in restoring the public confidence in how this House does business in passing the Congressional Accountability Act. Let's not wreck that good record. Let's not wreck that goodwill by approving this rule that doesn't allow members to read the bill and waives the scope of the conference so that pure, unadulterated pork will sneak through simply because nobody has had the time to expose it to the light of day. Please vote no.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of debate only, I yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Valentine.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker and my colleagues, it's clear to the American people want this Congress at this time at every government level to continue and accelerate the fight against the nation's #1 enemy, and that is, of course, crime. Once again, however, a debate on crime has been overshadowed by a sideshow produced and directed by the National Rifle Association. It's time that the House members recognize that the NRA leadership has no interest in combating crime. Indeed, it is preoccupied with collecting dues and contributions. Any scare tactic is acceptable as long as it fills the NRA coffers. To listen to the NRA's shop-worn arguments, twisted constitutional interpretations, and bullying threats, one would never know that this bill contains only a modest provision to ban a few weapons that have virtually no sporting purposes and that are owned by only a few law-abiding citizens. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker and my colleagues, about my motives. I have been a hunter. I collect guns. I keep a loaded gun in my home, and I hope I'd have the courage to use it. I'm a gun man, but I do not need an assault rifle, and I do not believe that passage of this bill will lead to a long-term federal government confiscating all firearms, and I urge my members, those members who hear my voice, who have been harangued and pushed and shoved and threatened by this organization, to rise above that and help us give the American people what they need. Let's pass this bill and go home with a crime bill. And I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield for unanimous consent request to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Packard.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and rise in strong opposition to this rule.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the committee, Mr. Fish of New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this rule. The conference report contains provisions which I oppose. The conference committee deleted provisions which I supported. However, my opposition to this rule is based as much on procedural objections as it is on substantive policy. Mr. Speaker, victims of crime are real people. They are our constituents, and the ultimate victim is society. Congress should address this complex problem in a comprehensive, realistic, and bipartisan way. And whether we are Republicans or Democrats, this is a national crisis that we share, and partisan politics should not interfere with the best solutions. In March, following action by the House Judiciary Committee on the crime bill, I went before the Rules Committee urging that certain key amendments be made in order, amendments put forward by Republican members of our committee which reflected, in my judgment, a number of very valid and valuable approaches. When this legislation was brought to the floor in April, several of my Republican colleagues were prevented from offering amendments under a highly restrictive King of the Hill rule. After the legislation passed the House of Representatives, I appointed the 4 most senior Republican members of the House Committee on the Judiciary to serve on the Conference Committee on the Crime Bill. For weeks and months, the Conference Committee did not meet. Republican members were routinely excluded from closed-door meetings. Finally, when the Conference Committee briefly convened, Republican members were routinely refused key documents, and several significant Republican amendments were dropped or weakened. Ultimately, none of the Judiciary Republican conferees signed the report. How could they approve a document which they had no part in formulating? And weeks later, Mr. Speaker, how can members who have not seen a conference report be expected to vote for it? Mr. Speaker, I stand here as the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee. The upcoming vote on the rule is a procedural vote that must be evaluated in the light of these events. The rules process goes to the very heart of our role as legislators and our rights as members of this body. Mr. Speaker, I will vote no on this rule.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal. Purpose of debate only.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the #1 obligation of government anywhere is to provide for the security of its people. And real national defense means having streets that are safe to walk and parks that are safe to visit. The philosopher Rousseau described life in the state of nature as being blissful anarchy. Well, in the cities of America today, it's anything but happiness. Street crime has done more to ruin the reputation of urban life than any other single element. And this bill has a solid piece of prevention as well as enforcement. All law enforcement officials across this country support this legislation, and Bill Clinton ought to be congratulated for proceeding with it. Yes, we should build bigger jails to ensure that convicted criminals serve the time, but we also have to take steps and preventive measures before they get started. These preventive programs will do just that. Let's cut down on the violence. Let's cut street crime. Let's cut gang activity. Let's end the state of chaos. Let's protect the public. Vote yes on this rule and vote yes on this bill.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield for the unanimous consent request. The distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Levy.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in total opposition to this rule, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Dunn.
Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
The gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this rule and with a deep sense of outrage. This crime bill is not well reasoned. By now, all members know of the ill-considered provisions that never could stand alone on this floor were they to be subjected to a vote. My outrage, however, is reserved for another issue. What do we do when sexual predators are released back into our neighborhoods? Let me recount the history. The Senate adopted a provision encouraging community notification when sexual predators are released from prison. The House, despite objections from the Rules Committee, finally made its will known when this body voted 407 to 13 to instruct House conferees to accept the Senate language. Then what happened? A handful of conferees snubbed their noses at the will of the United States Congress, both the House and the Senate, and weakened the Senate language on sexual predators beyond recognition. They diminished the length of time that predators are tracked. They stacked the deck against community notification, and they did this in the face of yet another bloody tragedy. 7-year-old Megan Kanka of New Jersey is dead, Mr. Speaker. Sexual predators were released into her community, and they lured that precious little girl to a grisly death. Conferees who work to protect the rights of sexual predators should understand this: the next little girl killed by a released predator will haunt them. Mr. Speaker, it's outrageous that a few conferees have supplanted their will for the will of the House. It's outrageous that this bill effectively denies notification to the next Megan Kanka or the next Polly Klaas or to your mother or your sister or your daughter. And it's outrageous, Mr. Speaker, that we would place the rights of criminals over the rights of victims. I won't be a party to it. I will vote to reject this rule. I will vote to tell the conferees to reflect the will of the House and the Senate. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hefner.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I speak with a little bit of credibility on this, I think, this bill. I'm one of those rare individuals that voted for the racial justice provision, and I also voted against the assault weapons ban. And I also supported the amendment of the gentlelady from Washington. This is not a perfect bill. If we wait for a perfect bill, it will never come before this House. And I'd like to speak to some of those folks that say, well, I just cannot vote for the rule, but I'm going to vote for the bill. That doesn't make a lot of sense. If we can't get a rule passed, we can't vote for the bill. And let me say to you, those folks that say they don't know what's in this bill, it strikes me as a little bit odd because every talk show host and all the pundits have been talking about the basketball and everything for 2 weeks on this bill. And you would think that the only thing in this bill is night basketball. But let me say to you, on night basketball, every small community in my district, when I go visit with the city officials, they talk about they need to try to find something for the young people to do. Doesn't it make more sense to have a night league of basketball that is supervised than to have gangs on the street corners that are mugging people? This is not a perfect bill, but this is a good bill. If it is so bad, if this bill is so bad, let us pass this rule and vote the bill down. The Republicans do not want a vote on this bill. They want to kill this rule, and it's not about money. It's not about social programs. It is about the two issues that are predominant in this bill that has the objections is racial justice on the one hand and guns on the other. It's just as simple as that, and I voted for both of them. But give us a vote. You that are hesitating to vote for this rule, give us a chance to vote on the bill. And then when we bring the bill up, if you don't like the bill, vote against the bill if it is so bad, but give us an opportunity to exercise our democratic right in this body to vote for this bill and vote for this bill conference, I would hope that we would not be intimidated by the scare tactics, and I've been threatened all day that I will not be back here if I vote for this rule, and I may not be back. But I can get up in the morning and look myself in the mirror and say, I gave the people an opportunity to vote for a conference report.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For purposes of unanimous consent request, I yield to Mr. Bartlett of Maryland.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise to report the intent to create a crime against the American people through this rule and the crime bill, which I strongly oppose, and ask unanimous consent to advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Mr. Gekas.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker and members of the House, when the death penalty provisions in this bill reached this House, they were constitutionally flawed, purposely so in my judgment, because those words, those provisions on the death penalty were crafted by the longtime opponents of the death penalty. Why? So that they could put together a bill that says we're tough on crime by instituting the death penalty, but leaving it so flawed that it would not be constitutionally sound. Well, the House then voted on the Geekus amendments, rejected the flawed language, reinstituted proper constitutionally sound instructions by the court in those procedures, and lo and behold, we had a bill in the death penalty portions of which we could support. But then what happened was that the conferees, contrary to the will of the House, and contrary to the will of a second vote by the House on instructing those conferees, blatantly again went back to the original flawed death penalty language. And here we are today with a death penalty bill that has no teeth in it in this particular version. We need to go back to the conference and reconstruct the death penalty bill that will meet the constitutional muster, and which the people in our country who want to be tough, not falsely tough, who want to be strong, not apparently strong on appearances only, but fair and tough, and to do the ultimate will of the American people to institute a death penalty that will act as a deterrent to violent crime and will end the endless death row appeals that make us sick and tired of the criminal justice system that now doesn't allow the death penalty to be applied in its proper way. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina. Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Foglietta.
Without objection. Mr. Speaker, after much soul-searching, I rise to say that I intend to vote for the rule which will allow us to consider this crime bill. And I urge my colleagues to join me in passing a bill to deal with the problem that our constituents say is most on their mind, the problem of crime. A racial justice provision did not survive the conference committee. This is wrong. There is racism in the imposition of the death penalty in this country. We should be voting for a bill that uses basic American principles of justice if we are to send human beings to the electric chair. But for this one provision that is not in the bill, there is much good. It is important to remind my colleagues where I come from. I founded and chair of the Congressional Urban Caucus, and I represent one of the most troubled urban districts in America. It's a poor district. It is struggling, and it is at war with crime. In our country, we're supposed to live free, but crime has robbed the people of my district from the very freedom to walk the streets outside their homes. They are now forced to keep their children prisoners in their homes. They can't go out because other kids are playing with assault weapons. A young girl in my district, this little Michelle Kuttner, was on the last day of school walking back home from school with her mother. She stopped at the corner store to buy a bag of potato chips. As she ate that bag of potato chips, a 15-year-old boy, Jerome Walker, wanted a lift from his friend who would not give it to him. Jerome took out a Tech-9, started shooting. Michelle was killed. Part of the special interest campaign to block this crime bill has been to criticize prevention programs as pork. They belittle innovative midnight basketball program, but they ignore the facts. Experience all around this country shows us that a little spending on recreational crime prevention stops a lot of crime. They spent 60 cents per child in Phoenix to keep basketball courts open until 2 a.m. last summer, and juvenile crime dropped by 55%. So what's going on here? We have to disarm the National Rifle Association in this town. They don't tell us what to do. Our constituents tell us what to do. They're telling us to pass this bill. Let's do it for them. Let's do it for little Michelle Kuttner. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield for unanimous consent request to the distinguished gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Barrett.
I rise in opposition to the rule and to the conference report as well, and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, my colleague on the ranking on the Rules Committee, Mr. Dreyer.
I thank my friend for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, this is a clearly unfair rule, though tragically not unprecedented. The call for blanket waivers basically means that there are many items in that thick package sitting next to Mr. Solomon over there which many have not been able to read. But clearly there are some appealing aspects of the crime bill. One of the most appealing is the idea of 100,000 new police officers on the street. We've all heard that figure from the President, from members of both houses of Congress. This has been touted all across the country. But the fact of the matter is, if we look at the funding that is ostensibly supposed to be provided by this, we would be lucky to get to 1/4 that number. Why? Because in a nationwide survey that was conducted by the Judiciary Committee and some other operations, they found that the average cost per officer for equipment, salary, overtime is $65,000 per year, yet this bill only provides $14,700 per officer. So we'd be lucky to get the $25,000, and yet we continue to hear this 100,000 figure. The waivers that have been granted in this thing make it a clearly unfair rule. We should reject this, bring about a rule and a crime package which can, in fact, deal with what the American people want us to address.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Torres.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Speaker, I'm especially pleased that the crime bill includes a provision to combat violent criminal street gangs. The criminal street gang provision in this bill sends a strong message to hardened gang members that the violence that they perpetuate will not be tolerated. Punishment will be enforced. Passage of this rule embodies our commitment to take back our neighborhoods, give our children a future, and provide an opportunity to join together in the fight against crime. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this rule. It's important to the whole country.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield to my colleague and friend from Florida, Mr. Stern, for a unanimous consent request.
I thank my colleague from Florida. And Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and request that I can revise and extend my comments and be part of the record.
Without objections.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Schiff, who is on the committee.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This is supposed to be an anti-crime bill, but the Congress is being blackmailed into supporting it. What do I mean? There are numerous provisions in the bill that I believe are positive accomplishments for law enforcement. But in order to get to them, we have to vote for a conference report that also contains provisions which I believe would never pass the Congress if they stood there by themselves. 2 examples. First, an elimination from mandatory minimum sentencing totally for certain drug traffickers. And although that provision is in the bill, the President and the Attorney General have never boasted about that provision when they go around the country and say why we need this bill. Why aren't they proud enough of it to talk about it? Second of all, outrageous spending that has nothing to do with law enforcement. I'm not getting involved in the crime prevention versus law enforcement debate. There are spending programs in this bill which never were even intended for crime prevention by their authors. They became crime prevention programs only to get them in this bill to have spending programs that wouldn't pass any other way. We can solve this problem. We can vote against the rule. We can send this bill back to the Joint Committee for more revision, and that's what I urge my colleagues to do. I yield back any time.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Extend my remarks. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I wrote the racial justice provision. The Senate took it out of this bill, but I'm supporting this rule because I come from one of the cities where guns are easier to get than jobs, where gun licenses are more available and easier to obtain than driver's licenses, where we have a situation that's got to be changed by this House. For 3 years, we've tried to get a crime bill, and we've now got a smart crime bill. I don't apologize to anyone in this nation for bringing a crime prevention package to the crime bill. We need this. And the other part of it is that the National Rifle Association is not going to get the last laugh on us. We know they're trying to get to assault weapons. That cannot come out of this bill. It'll never come up in another bill. And so in the name of all of those mayors and sheriffs and police chiefs and community organizations that have talked to me and begged to me, let's have a tough, sensible, smart crime bill. The time is now. Vote for the rule and support this bill.
The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield for purposes of unanimous consent. Request the distinguished gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Stump.
Without objection.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this rule. Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, when the President talks about fighting crime, he sounds like Dirty Harry, but his crime bill looks like Barney Fife. Overall, this crime bill includes almost $1.5 billion for cultural health classes, dance programs, cultural sensitivity instruction, counseling services, self-esteem training, and midnight basketball. With the pork barrel spending included in this bill, we could put 360,000 more criminals behind bars. How can we support this bill when the nation's top law enforcement official, President Clinton's hand-picked crime fighter, FBI Director Louis Freeh, in a moment of candor when he was outside the Beltway, told how this bill will cause drastic reductions in the number of FBI agents? I urge my colleagues to reject this bill, send it back to conference, and let's come back with a bill that truly does fight crime.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield to the gentlelady from California for a purpose for unanimous consent.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support, unswerving support of the rule and the bill, and ask for permission to revise and extend my comments.
Without objections.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlewoman from Utah, Ms. Shepard.
Mr. Speaker, last week in Salt Lake County, a young man was shot and killed while standing at his apartment complex, the victim of another drive-by shooting. The perpetrator was a 16-year-old with 88 previous violations. We need to put monsters like this away permanently, and we need to stop making monsters. This crime bill does both. It's both tough and smart. A vote against this rule is a vote against the safety of the American people, and it is a vote against what people have asked us to do. I urge this House to pass the rule.
The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains to either side?
The gentleman from Florida has 12 1/2 minutes. The gentleman from South Carolina has 11 1/2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield for purposes of unanimous consent request to the distinguished gentleman from the Ocean State, Rhode Island, my friend Ron Makeley.
Thank you very much for yielding. I rise in opposition to this rule and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
I thank my friend from Florida for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise to strongly oppose the rule. The Clinton crime bill should not be enacted in its current form. Instead, it should be incarcerated for mugging the American taxpayer and for murdering the truth so many times that it qualifies as a serial killer. This legislation is larded and laced with billions of dollars in misplaced social spending. In fact, there is more money for social programs than there is for prison construction. Over $9 billion is included for vague social spending to finance such stringent anti-crime measures as arts and crafts, self-esteem enhancement, dance, and of course midnight basketball. All this on the theory that the person who stole your car, robbed your house, and assaulted your family was no more than a disgruntled artist or would-be NBA star. Even worse than the money this bill throws away is the opportunity it discards to do something serious about crime. Crime is America's primary concern. This bill makes clear it is not the administration's. I urge a defeat of the rule so we can send this bill back to conference with the message America is sending. be tougher on criminals than they are on us. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Saunders.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, last year, all 6 women who were murdered in the state of Vermont were killed by their spouses and partners, and hundreds more were battered. Domestic violence exists in epidemic proportions throughout this country. This legislation provides $8 million for my small state of Vermont to combat violence against women and $1.8 billion nationally. This is money that is long overdue. Mr. Speaker, let us stand up for battered women, stand up for social justice, and while this is a far from perfect bill, it is a major step forward. Let's support the rule.
The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of unanimous consent request, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Oxley.
Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and point out that the top law enforcement officer in this country, the director of the FBI, has serious concerns about this legislation. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Zimmer. No, we're doing 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. In March of this year, 6-year-old Amanda Wengert of Manalapan, New Jersey, was kidnapped from her home and brutally killed by her next-door neighbor, who no one in the neighborhood knew had been convicted for twice assaulting children in the past. Less than 2 weeks ago, Megan Kanka of Hamilton Square, New Jersey, was invited to visit her neighbors who lived right across the street from her. One of them had a new puppy he wanted to show her, he said. She was raped and brutally murdered. Her parents didn't know that this man had twice been convicted of similar crimes, or that he was living with 2 other men who were also sex offenders. I believe that Amanda and Megan would be alive today if their parents knew the predators who lived in their neighborhood. We in this House and the members of the Senate have voted overwhelmingly in favor of effective community notification legislation that would have accomplished this very simple objective. But when the legislation came to the conference committee, a small number of conferees arrogated to themselves the right to water down and strip this legislation of its original content. Now, the section that was originally captioned community notification is captioned instead privacy of data. That means that the rights of our predators are being put above the rights of their potential victims. Vote to kill this rule and open up the legislation so we can protect young lives in the future. Yield back my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Without objections.
Members who represent suburban districts have greater reason than ever to vote for this rule. Suburban communities like mine work together through regional task forces to target crimes that often cross municipal lines. The crime bill now contains language that I proposed so that the cops on the beat provision can be used to support regional task forces in the fight against drugs, auto theft, violent criminals, and youthful offenders. Support our suburban police in their fight against crime. Vote for the rule and the bill.
The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield for purposes of unanimous consent to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Porter.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and ask leave to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Volkmer.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
I yield to the gentleman from Texas for unanimous consent request.
Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the rule and the bill and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
I also yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall, for unanimous consent request.
For consideration of the crime bill conference and ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I first want to say I commend the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brooks, for the work that he's done on this crime legislation. But I feel that I have to vote against the rule, and if the rule passes, I'm going to have to vote against the bill for various reasons. Now, I want to make it clear in here, from listening to both sides, it appears that maybe somebody on this side is not for fighting crime, and some people on this side are really not for fighting crime. I don't know anyone in this House that isn't for fighting crime. We have a disagreement as to how we should fight that crime. And I think that mislead the members of the House also to say if this rule goes down, you'll never see a crime bill. Now, wait a minute, folks. We're going to be here till middle of October or later. We've got plenty of time to work up a crime bill that all of us could support. All of us want to support a crime bill. There isn't anybody here that doesn't want to support a crime bill. For that reason, I'm going to vote against the rule, and hopefully with my friend from Texas and others, we can have a crime bill that we can all support.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Hughes, for purpose of debate only.
Without objections.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I disagree with my colleague who just went before me. There are people in this House that do not want this president to have a crime bill. And I've never seen such arm twisting on this side of the aisle to deny him that agenda. That's what it's all about, folks. I've listened about the description about sexual predator. Well, let me tell you, my friends, you read it. You read it. It's broader than when it left the House, and it's smarter than when it left the House. The Senate version that so many people brag on was a very narrow definition of a sexual predator dealing with those with mental abnormalities. And it required a court adjudication. In this crime bill, you have a registry for sexual offenders against children, and you have, in addition to that, notification by the chief law enforcement officer. And you'll read that. It's just nonsense. What this is all about is not about a procedural vote. You know, a vote against the rule is a vote against the crime bill. You're not going to fool the American public. It's a vote against the crime bill. They're trying to kill the crime bill. And it's about guns among colleagues on this side and that side, and an agenda on this side that doesn't include a crime bill. I urge my colleagues to support the rule.
The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. For purpose of unanimous consent request, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Emerson.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Thank you.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself a minute and a half. Mr. Speaker, to give you an idea of how bad this bill is, my office received a call from a social worker in my district whose programs stand to gain financially from the vast spending in this bill. And that person called to complain about the $33 billion price tag, the lack of enforcement provisions, and the perverse priorities and incentives in this bill. This is the true voice of the people. This bill barely mentions victims, but it lavishes billions on criminals. Let me explain. For 30 years in this country, we have been funding social programs aimed at criminal problems. We have spent $5 trillion in 30 years doing that, and the crime rate has gone up 500%. It doesn't work that way, and the American people want us to get tough. They want tough penalties, they want prisons, and they want good enforcement out there. There's another problem with this bill. Nobody's talked about the cost. It's a $25 billion budget buster. We've got $22 billion in here, and that doesn't get us to what we're going to spend on this thing, including the out years. I've added in $13 billion in there for the out years so that we don't create any myths. If there's one question the American people should ask their representatives about this bill, it's going to be, have you read it? Have you read this bill? Have you read every word of it? Have you read the conference report? I dare say there are very few members here who could answer any of those questions in the affirmative. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Do it right now, unanimous consent.
I recognize the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Klein, for purpose of unanimous consent request.
Speaker, I rise to support the rule and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Mr. Laurel.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend. Mr. Speaker, I rise today not only in support of this rule, but in support of taking a stand. After months of consideration, countless hours of debate, we've arrived at the precipice. We can take the easy way out, defeat the rule, and back away from our responsibility, or we can show some courage, exhibit some leadership, and pass the rule and bring the crime bill to a vote. Consider those who live in fear and whose lives would be helped by this crime bill and whose lives would be greatly improved. Think of this when you vote on this rule, and consider the words of Andrew Jackson. One man or one woman with courage makes the majority. Vote for the rule.
The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, our conference chairman, Mr. Army.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, earlier in this debate, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richardson, characterized this as the vote of the year. It may or may not be that, but it is a serious moment. This is a serious business. I don't have to recite the crime statistics to you. I don't have to tell personal anecdotes about youngsters harmed, maimed, and killed. We know we have a crisis in America, and we know that America expects us to act. We know that we are late in getting a crime bill to this floor, and we know that the reason we are late in doing so is that you wrote a crime bill that you can't sell to your members. We know that, and I'm sorry for that. We should have acted before this. Now, Mr. Richardson says if we don't do it today, it won't get done. Can it be, on one hand, the most important thing we have to do, and then on the other hand, something that we won't have time to do if we can't do it your way? And now I'm told that we Republicans are going to cast our most important vote of the year to deny your president a victory? Let me tell you, my friends on the Democrat side of the aisle, your president is just...
House will be in order.
Your president is just not that important to us. We will cast our vote here as a matter of conscience. We're not going to cast our vote here out of fear that we would not be railroaded by buzzword blackmail into voting for a bill that spends $33 billion of the taxpayers' money doing too much of the wrong things and too little of the right things to make our children safe in our own neighborhoods. It's not a matter of our concerns about you or your political future or that of your president. It's not a matter of our concerns about us or our political future or that of ourselves. It is a matter of our concern about whether or not we keep the trust and the faith and the commitment that the American people have given us to come to this floor timely, which you failed to do, with good legislation, which you failed to create, in order to keep our children safe. Our children don't need midnight basketball. Our children don't need more arts and crafts. Our children don't need more sensitivity training. Our children need law enforcement, good jurisdiction, imprisonment, and safety. And I say vote no on this, and you bring back a decent bill.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Coppersmith.
Speaker.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, a vote against this rule is a vote against the crime bill. My wife Beth and I share the fears of parents everywhere in this country raising our 3 kids in an increasingly violent world. We used to assume a loud bang on the street was a car backfire. Now we wonder if it was a gunshot. We read about school kids with guns instead of books in their backpacks. This bill isn't perfect, but if we wait for perfection, we will lose our battle against crime, a fight too important to lose to partisan politics or pride of authorship or fear of the gun lobby. I yield back.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Under 30 seconds.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Weed.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this rule and the strongest anti-crime legislation in our nation's history. For the last year, Mr. Speaker, I've traveled to Missouri communities large and small, listening to police, prosecutors, and countless ordinary citizens who live with fear of crime every day. They all give me the same message: help us win the war against crime. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. If this rule loses, there will be no winners. If this rule loses, 100,000 cops will be lost. Crime prevention funds will be lost. Thousands of prison cells are lost. Tougher sentencing provisions are lost. The hopes of millions living in fear of crime every day are lost. Let's pass this conference report. It's not a small step. It's a giant leap in the fight against crime and drugs. If you want to be tough on crime, prove it today. Support this rule. Support this legislation.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Durbin.
Without objections.
Be honest, my colleagues. Should any member of Congress or his family be victimized by crime, he would call the police, not a lobbyist from the National Rifle Association. Shame on those members of Congress who would ask our police to risk their lives to protect us and then turn their backs on these same police who beg us to pass this crime bill. Most of my Republican colleagues are determined to gridlock Congress on this crime bill. They believe killing this bill or any crime bill will elect more Republicans. I think the American voters can see through this political charade. The people I represent are more interested in a victory over violent crime than any political victory. Listen to our police. Listen to America. Vote yes on the rule and on the crime bill.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Fazio.
Mr. Speaker, on May 5th, in an extraordinarily effective bipartisan show of support for the banning of assault weapons, this House, by a small margin, did something that nobody believed we could do. And despite all the rhetoric, all the nitpicking of what is always a compromise when a bill this big is brought to a final resolution, we all understand, everyone in this chamber knows, we're revoting that vote today. Now, there were 38 Republicans who stood courageously against the gun owners of America, stood up against the opposition to the NRA, and told their constituents they were with them on this overwhelmingly popular position, the banning of assault weapons. But today, something's different. We don't know where all those votes have gone. I think we do have some understanding. There's intimidation, yes. Pressure, yes. Where's it coming from? I can tell you the National Committee of the Republican Party has before it a resolution which takes those 38 people to task, says they should be deprived of their funding for re-election, says they should have real Republicans standing up to defeat them when they go for re-election. This is part and parcel of why this vote today is in doubt. We're not here debating the question of assault weapons. Honestly, what we are facing up to is intimidation and pressure from political leadership. I'm asking those 38 Republicans who have the courage to stand up and say, therefore, the police in their communities and for the people who believe we should have an assault ban, to stand up to the NRC, to stand up to their leadership and ratify their real beliefs.
Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purpose of debate only, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Brooks of Texas.
Thank you very much. I ask the United States to provide and extend my remarks and say that it is very difficult for me to believe that for the past 10 days the question that's held up the crime bill is not whether you're for or against the crime bill, but whether you even want the House to vote on it. Well, if your dream is becoming part of a filibuster one day, run for the Senate. But don't delude yourself into thinking that the American public is in any way impressed. No procedural vote isn't about whether to gut this 2 years of work on some procedural ploy. It's about throwing away almost 4 years of work as the American people continue to live in constant fear in their workplace, in their neighborhoods, in their homes. Now, I will tell you that in the last Congress, there were great expectations about passing a crime bill. The House did not succumb to partisanship. We passed a crime bill October 22nd of '91. The Senate did likewise a month later on November 24th of '91. The conference met, returned. The House conference report approved the report on November the 27th of 1991, 4 days later. When that conference went to the Senate, a group of obstructionist Republicans, I'll tell you, that's right, distraught that Democrats could actually write a tough, good crime bill. They bottled the bill up for 11 months. Congress wagged its tail and adjourned. Now the Republicans, our friends, are working day and night, all in the service of a campaign to not have a campaign, not have a crime bill for the 4th year. Now, we are not perfect people. I'm not. I don't think y'all are. And I don't think the bill is. Not many of them are. Most of you are keenly aware of my profound disappointment at inclusion of the ill-conceived ban on assault weapons, so broadly cast as to insult the dignity and good name of legitimate and good law-abiding gun owners across the nation. I was outvoted by the House and Senate conferees in attempting to strip out this punitive vendetta. But to this day, I say plainly that the assault ban provision should never have been included, and I'll be back sooner than some think to right that wrong. What I want to say now is I think every member of this Congress should vote for the rule and let the members of Congress decide whether or not to have a crime bill, whether we want to help the people in this country. In every congressional district, the number one issue is what are you going to do, if anything, about crime. I ask you to vote for the rule and for the conference report. Urge all my colleagues to support them both.
The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of unanimous consent, I yield to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Everett.
Mr. Speaker, I oppose this rule. I ask permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of unanimous consent only, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Speaker, I rise in opposition to this rule. Megan Kagan, the 7-year-old who was brutally killed by a sexual predator, Mr. Speaker, lived in my district, and the language for the community right to know in this bill is very, very weak, and I would hope it would go back to conference and parallel what my good friend from Washington tried to get passed. This is very weak language.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, my colleague and friend, Mr. McCollum, who's on the committee.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
I rise in opposition to this rule. I think it's outrageous that some have suggested on that side of the aisle that we Republicans over here are somehow trying to defeat this bill, and we're not. And in fact, they've got 79 more members on that side of the aisle than we have over there. There's no way we can beat this rule or the bill, either one, without a lot of Democrats who vote to do so as well. What we're concerned about is not playing politics like Mr. Fazio wanted to do here. He knows good and well that Haley Barbour, our Republican National Committee chairman, had withdrawn that resolution that might have criticized our members for whatever they might have voted on a gun proposal. And he should know, as I do, that the Republicans over here on our side of the aisle are not sending this bill back to the committee, don't want to send it over to the conference committee to get it worked on some more because of the gun issue. We want to send it back over there to be worked on, not to kill it, but to be worked on and brought back out here, because we understand that this is an imbalanced and imperfect bill that isn't going to do the job. The fact of the matter is there's $8 to $9 billion in this $30 billion plus bill, $8 to $9 billion in new Great Society social welfare spending, the most in 20 years. And it's imbalanced because if we look at what we've got in this bill for prisons, which is the main thing that we can do to help the states to solve the crime problem, we only have $6.5 billion, not the 8 whatever that's been put out here. Half the amount passed by this House of $13 billion, and not nearly enough to do the job that we heard from the Bureau of Prisons is required. They say we need at least $10.5 to $12 billion in grant money to the states to build new prisons if we're going to give them enough to take off the streets the 6% of those criminals who are committing 70% of the violent crimes of this country and only serving about 1/3 of their sentences, and make them serve 85% of their sentences if they're repeat violent offenders. That is, put truth in sentencing in the law. It's going to take that kind of money. We shouldn't be spending social welfare money out here like this. We shouldn't be increasing programs for the midnight basketball and the teaching the dance lessons and the artistic classes and all of that kind of nonsense to get at root causes of crime. We should be putting the money where it needs to be put, where the Bureau of Prisons and others have said it is required if we're going to actually solve the problem the American public want. We need to put swiftness and certainty of punishment back into the system again. We need to have deterrence of criminal laws in this country, deterrence of crime, which is the true prevention. And then if we want to get to the root causes, we need to bring out a welfare reform bill to change the rules of the game out here so that we can put incentives back in the law for families to stay together again instead of having the way it is now, and get moral values taught again. That's the real root cause problem. But in the meantime, let's save the patient who's been run over by the truck and has all these internal injuries, who's bleeding to death over here because his arm's been cut off. Let's at least apply the tourniquet and stop the violent crime program here that's going on out in our country by getting the resources that are necessary to the prisons. And all we have to do that is take away some of this nonsense and this $8 or $9 billion of new social welfare, Great Society spending. Take a few $1 billion of that in the conference committee where we'll send this bill back to today if we defeat this rule, and put it where it ought to be, on prisons, and put the right amount of money in there, and send a good, tough, hard crime bill back here for us to vote on. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of debate only, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Gephardt.
Without objections.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, the decision that we make today is between one on procedure or one about people. I know the heartfelt disagreement on so many points in this bill, on both sides of the aisle. And I know those disagreements are heartfelt. But the question we have to ask is, will we remain frozen in disagreement? Or will we be able to act? A lot of people say we'll go back to conference and we'll do this and we'll do that and we'll do the other thing. It's taken us a year and a half to get to this day. In 1991, it took us over a year to get to a filibuster that stopped any crime bill from going forward. It is overly optimistic to think that it's easy to take out the part that I don't like or the part that you don't like, or to revise this or that to get back to something that we like. Just for a moment before you cast this vote, take out of your mind the things in the bill that you don't like. And keep in mind the 4 children in my town of St. Louis whose mother was shot and killed on her own porch last week in a senseless, meaningless killing. Think about the 2 teenagers in San Marino, California, gunned down by gang members in a high school. Think about the young woman here in Washington who was slain in a drug-related shooting when she was 7 months pregnant with her own child. Think of the 3rd grader in Chicago who was asked by her teacher to share her feelings about violence and shared the story of her young cousin shot in the head by another boy playing with a gun. Think of the 2 elderly women in St. Louis, 87 and 76, who were raped at gunpoint. That's what this bill is about. Don't think about each little provision that you may not like. Think about the people who count on us today to come to their aid with something, not to be frozen in our disagreement, but to find an agreement. And finally, think about the young girl written about here in the Washington Post who thinks not about her cares and concerns, but because she has lived with so much death, so much pain, so much tragedy, that she dreams not of her prom dress, but of her funeral dress. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, are we going to respond to her, or are we going to act? Think about her, vote for this rule. Let's make this country safe again.
The gentleman from Florida.
Hey, may I inquire, distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, if you have any speakers other than your closing speaker?
I have one closing speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, at this time it is my privilege to yield the balance of our time to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois. All the time that's left, Mr. Leader, Mr. Michael of Illinois. 4 minutes, I believe.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend
Without
my remarks.
objections.
Mr. Speaker and my colleagues, I rise in opposition to the rule, compliment the distinguished majority leader for the impassioned plea he's made on the other side of this issue. Let me also take the opportunity to applaud those of you on both sides of the aisle who have so eloquently and forcefully pointed out the deficiencies in the conference report that this rule makes in order. Somewhere, buried deep within the layers upon layers of big dollar items in this crime bill is a workable, useful policy of prevention, education, and punishment. But the rule does not allow us to strip away the many expensive and unnecessary parts that now deform the bill. What we have instead is the unholy political trinity of pork, posturing, and partisanship. At one point, we did have a tough crime bill, one that focused on taking repeat offenders off the street, one that built more prisons, one that imposed tough sentences. That tough bill is not the one before us tonight. I've put out an all-points bulletin, but I'm afraid it has met its demise. Our constituents have pleaded with us to alleviate their fear, make their schools and streets safe again after adding up better than $30 billion in this bill, much of it unfunded. We're not going to be answering their plea. This bill could have been, it should have been, a lean, mean crime-fighting machine. But there are too many election year goodies, trinkets, and gift-wrapped spending programs piled on it, and now it looks like Santa Claus wearing a sheriff's badge. This is not a battle between detention and prevention. We need both. And the question before us is one of high public policy. What kind of federal legislation best helps our society uphold the rule of law? It's a time of rising crime rates and rising public demands for action, but it is also a time of budget deficits, a time when every tax dollar must be spent wisely. That's why we ought to defeat this rule. The rule does not allow us to save what is best and get rid of what is worst in the bill as it now stands. My colleagues, I believe we can craft a sensible bill that combines workable elements of detention and prevention. But if the rule passes, we will be asked to vote on a bill that would direct too many tax dollars into areas that may be politically useful for some of our members, but have little to do with fighting crime. And in my opinion, we can't afford such waste. Our constituents who want safe streets and safe schools can't afford it. And maybe one final word, particularly on my side of the aisle. This is a procedural vote. It's a vote on a rule. How many times have we been had on our side of the aisle by the rules of this House? This is a procedural vote, and it means whether or not we can make an impact and a difference on cleaning up a bad bill. That's what it's all about. And you ought to take advantage of that opportunity. Don't let it slip through your fingers when it's right at hand. That's my message to you tonight. With all due respect to my friend from New Mexico, vote down the rule and the bill is dead, killed. I'll take a different view with respect to our president, because our president's made some strong, impassioned appeals for a strong crime bill, and I respect that. We want to do the same. We have our differences of opinion on both sides of the aisles and within our parties on how best to do it. That's what it's all about. And it's on the margin of whether or not we're going to get one more opportunity to clean it up the way it ought to be cleaned up, or let it go by as is. I would plead with members, vote down this rule. Give us that one other opportunity.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to the distinguished Speaker of the House, Mr. Foley, for purpose of debate only.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objections.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, I think everyone knows that it is relatively rare for the Speaker to leave the chair and to speak in the well in debate on an issue. It is also very rare for him to vote. That's the tradition of the House. Like everyone else, I have the right to vote, and I will exercise it in voting for this rule and in voting for this bill. And I do so because, frankly, I think it is a key vote, not for the President, and I was glad to hear our distinguished Republican leader talk about the President as our President. I've served here for 30 years. Richard Nixon was my president, our president. Ronald Reagan was our president. George Bush was our president. And Bill Clinton is our president. But it's not about the president. It's about our responsibility as members of the Congress to our constituents, to the 600,000 or so people in all the 435 districts in the 5 areas that are represented here in this chamber. This is the great collection, the Congress of the American people. And what are the American people telling us? They're telling us that after we have spent trillions of dollars, rightfully, and I voted for those trillions of dollars, to defend our country against foreign threat, their most deep concern for their security and the security of their families lies on the streets of our own cities and not on the beaches or airspace of our country from some foreign threat. We have conquered every reasonable foreign threat that could be placed against our people from outside the country, but inside the country, elderly people and children and families are afraid to go on the streets at night in their own communities. They've asked us to respond to that. It always seems that we get to the point of doing that and something intervenes. We passed the bill in the last Congress. It was filibustered in the Senate. And now procedural objections suggest we shouldn't even vote on this bill. We shouldn't even respond yes or no. I have a respect for anyone on either side of this aisle who says that he thinks or she thinks this bill should be voted down. But let the American people know your reasons and let them know your vote. To govern is to choose on the issue that the American people believe is the most central to their immediate concerns, their most deeply felt concerns of security in the future. This is a vote we cannot avoid and should not avoid. We should stand up and cast our votes and explain to our constituents the reasons for our actions. That is the very minimum of what they expect us to do.
In all the years that I've been in Congress, and I've been here 30 years, I have seen times in my experience when I thought that votes were perhaps even more crucial than the vote that we're casting today. Not many, but some. But this is a truly crucial and seminal vote. And it will determine, I think, not only the confidence in the country, in our ability as an institution to respond to their concerns and needs, but it will make a very real and tangible difference in the lives of my constituents in Eastern Washington, in the towns and cities of a largely rural part of our country. I used to be a deputy prosecutor. The days of my experience in law enforcement have been exceeded many, many times by the threats that exist in my communities as well as yours. Let us not be a helpless giant in response to the demands and concerns of our people. Let us respond to their most deeply felt needs and concerns. The society that cannot protect the physical security